It's not just responsible reporting that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about reporting that is actually helpful in addition to being responsible. As I mentioned about the power of media, again, you're not a stranger to this. But when you think about your audience, and you know, of course your audience is going to be a wide array of people, but you're writing about a subject that's going to interest some people in particular. Considering that about 20 million people are depressed in the United States every year, about 12 million people are thinking seriously about suicide every year here in the United States, and about 1 out of every 6 high school kids is thinking seriously about suicide. They're in your audience. Also in your audience of readership is half of America knows somebody who's died by suicide, and half of those people have lost a family member or someone very close to them, and may well be, many of them, affected for the rest of their lives by this. So they're in your audience, they're your readership, your viewership, and they are interested in this subject. And I would label them or refer to them as a more vulnerable group. And they could be affected by what it is that you're reporting. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of studies that show that media can influence our behavior, specifically around suicide. The 2 specific effects, you may have heard of the Werther effect, and Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther from, what was it, 1774. Napoleon Bonaparte said that this was the greatest piece of literature in Europe. And you know, here's this guy who was saying, this is so great. And it was about a young man who fell in love, and it was an unrequited love, and killed himself. And we saw about 2,000 people copycat, essentially. That was the first known instance of copycat suicide. So since then, we've been referring to this effect, this contagion effect that Bob referred to as the Werther effect. The Papageno effect is something that's relatively new in terms, not in terms of it actually happening, but in terms of it being coined and identified by a group in Austria. I'll tell you a little bit about that study later, but essentially it refers to a guy named Papageno in Mozart's Magic Flute. And Papageno lost his wife. He felt like he wanted to die, he wanted to join her, and was going to kill himself, and his sons talked him out of it. And then at the end of the opera, his wife comes back to him and says, "It's not your time. Please stay here. I love you and I'll always be with you." And everyone leaves the theater feeling very hopeful. And that's what the Papageno effect is, and we'll talk more about that. It's very important to our discussion. So this is what happens when people are influenced essentially by either suicide or suicide prevention messaging. The themes, when you are feeling in this vulnerable state that I'm referring to, anything that's reinforcing hopelessness, helplessness, or even giving you instruction on how to harm yourself, like here's how Robin Williams killed himself, that is where it puts us in the danger zone. Really, it's suicide reporting is where all the caveats lie, not with suicide prevention reporting. As far as I know, there's really no caveats to that. It's a very safe and important area that is really not talked about. I mean, Rick said we should be talking about suicide, yes, but we should really be talking about suicide prevention. Because what we do is promote hope and show people how to get help, and the help is effective, and also show examples of how people are healing through suicidal moments. When you do that, as I'll show you in a little while, it can actually reduce the suicide rate. But it's, again, that contagion concern that really motivated the media guidelines. There's been several versions of the media guidelines that have been created. This is the most recent one that came out in 2010. Dan was very much involved with this, along with the Annenberg Public Policy Center, National Alliance for Mental Illness, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, CDC, and others. And this has been ratified and observed as really the go-to document for those of you who are in this business and want to know what you should or shouldn't do in terms of reporting on suicide. You can see that at reportingsuicide.org or .com, either one. Will take you to the site that is, I think, really important. I believe most of you have this document on your drive that was given out. So this is a really big study that was highly influential in terms of why to have the media guidelines. And Vienna, a lot of reports were surfacing in the 80s and about people jumping on the subway tracks and killing themselves. And every time they reported that, people saw that, again, those vulnerable folks, and said, that's where I'm going to go. And they did. And the number of suicides went way up in Vienna as they continued to report on these suicides. They took a step back and said, my God, what is happening here? We have to stop reporting on suicide in these subways. It's not necessary. So, and occasionally they would do some reporting, but they said, let's take them off the front page, put them in the back pages, and they'd be very small articles. And when they did that, the subsequent reduction in suicides was dramatic. And that said, we've got to do more of this guidelining with media. And the biggest issues with media contagion relate to these three areas in the Werther effect. Frequency, don't repeatedly talk about the same suicide story. If you can, if you must report it once, and then move on to something else. Also putting it on placement in terms of, front page headlines, very splashy, very loud, really draws a lot of attention. And of course, vulnerable people will be drawn to that. And if it's very splashy, the idea of perhaps getting attention might also be something that attracts them. Language is also something that's been associated with the contagion effect. Anything that sensationalizes or glorifies or makes it sound common, or that suicide is really the right way to go, the right solution to your problems if things feel hopeless or helpless, and especially anything related to the method. It's kind of an instruction manual when you say, here's how Robin Williams killed himself. And this is an example of a headline that is inadvisable. But specifically when you have these methods that are displayed, not only, this was, obviously you have to report on a suicide like Robin Williams. There's no getting around that. But what to include and how to report on it is really important. And a lot of media reported on how he killed himself. So not only did we see a 10% rise in suicides after he killed himself for the next 30 days, but we also saw a specifically significant increase in suicides by hanging, the way he killed himself. So again, not a necessary detail, but it did have a dramatic effect. I think for us, when this article came out fairly recently, it was actually just released this year. This, I think, had a huge impact on the media in terms of their reaction post Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain's suicide. They all said to me, we don't want to cause a contagion like what happened with Robin Williams. Now this, even in reporting that story, some news outlets were concerned about, like, even reporting that, is that going to cause a problem? So what CNN did here, I thought, was just genius. They had done a story earlier based on this was something I think that, Dwight, you mentioned this earlier about Logic and 1-800-273-8255 hit song, which is basically a PSA for Lifeline for about 6 months, and just center calls through the roof. And essentially was a story about how a celebrity's influence was saving lives. And CNN and many other outlets did a story about how this song was in fact saving lives. So here is a story about a celebrity's death influencing suicides. And so they said, why don't we balance that by including our previous story, a video clip of the Logic story, and how a celebrity's influence actually reduces suicides. So this is truly an example of balanced reporting. And that's really what we're looking for when we're talking about reporting on suicide, is how do you also balance those concerning effects by adding some positive, or here's how to get help, here's where to get help, here's how help is effective, and any stories of hope that might be useful or applicable. You don't want to sensationalize. Now, this is not something that surprises you, but here I think it's more important to say, well, how do we report on it? This, I think, was brilliant. I mean, when you wonder, and nobody really had a cause to wonder, but what would the world's largest broadcast news station do if they lost one of their own? And unfortunately, we got the answer to that. And what they did was extraordinary. The reporting on this, on Anthony Bourdain's suicide, was incredible. This was an example of doing everything right. So what you see here It doesn't say Anthony Bourdain died by suicide. He's dead at 61, and that's the headline. And it's an important headline. And the picture of him does not show him like hanging his head or looking really depressed. It's just Anthony. And that's also great. And then it didn't say anything about how he died until the 8th paragraph. And then it just said he took his life at age 61. And then it didn't say how he killed himself. What it did say is his best friend, Eric Draper, found him dead. And that's all the drama you need, because that tells you how, can you imagine how horrific it would be to be his best friend discovering him? And so again, and of course CNN was filled with friends of Anthony, so they understood that's the perspective that we want to give here. And again, they balanced the headline with our phone number and steps on how people can help each other, which we'll get to later, the BeTheOne2.com thing that Lifeline promotes, which is 5 action steps that people can take to prevent suicide. So the other thing about glorifying and romanticizing anything that suggests that suicide is a noble or virtuous cause, or it's romantic in some way, and that you know, because they killed themselves, something good happened, or we all learned an important lesson. Obviously, something like 13 Reasons Why was a huge example of a concern about glorifying suicide, that, you know, it gave people their desserts when she killed herself. So that was obviously a concern for us. And here's a good example, too, of, you know, this suggests that this was perhaps a rational way to free himself of pain. No. And to note, what do you report? The facts. And specifically, you know, the facts of their life, not the facts of their death. Celebrate their life, like you would any obituary, anybody who's died. Talk about what their life has meant. Here's something else that we want you to do, is don't attribute suicide to a single cause. You see this fairly frequently. Well, he had a mental illness, or he lost his wife. Or, it's much more complicated than that. He was bullied. There's been a lot of people who've lost their loved one. There's a lot of people who've been bullied. There's a lot of people with mental illness. There's not a lot of people relative to those people who've killed themselves. There are no easy explanations. So keeping it as a multifactorial thing that we don't fully understand. It was highly complex. But what we do know is how to prevent suicide, and we'll talk more about that later. So some of the notes on language, I think, are very important. You know, that when we talk about increases in suicide, just call them that, as opposed to epidemics or it's skyrocketing. Again, these underscore the sense of hopelessness, like, oh my God, it's spreading like wildfire. That's not. Actually, it's the headlines that make it spread like wildfire. So just saying it increase or rise, there's no reason to make it that dramatic. Every one of those losses is dramatic in people's lives. Let's not make them any more dramatic than they are. And the referring to suicides as a successful suicide or a failed attempt, for those of us who have, you know, performance anxiety. You know, we want to succeed at everything. That's just not the right language. So neither is committed suicide. For those of us who've lost someone to suicide, coupling the word commit with suicide is also understood as a word that is coupled with committing a sin or committing a crime, which in one time suicide was considered both. So the stigma related to suicide is only enhanced by the word commit. If you just say died by suicide or killed themselves, is really the most effective way of talking about suicide. No reason to use those words. So let's talk about what's right and what can be right. The Papageno effect, and this is the balanced side of reporting. How can we, you know, in reporting on suicide, we can either A, report on suicide prevention, or we can also include suicide prevention information within the context of a story about suicide where appropriate. anything that enhances and reinforces messages of getting help, finding hope, and healing have a huge positive effect. Certainly, putting our numbers up there is something that has been frequently done and has been doing to good effect. As I mentioned before, there's this BeTheOneTo.com showing not only how to get help, but also how to help others is extremely important. I don't know, for some reason, all of the other, there's 5 action steps, and for some reason they're not showing, but you can just go to that BeTheOneTo.com and see them. Excuse me. It looks like we've lost, I don't see the graphic here, but just note that what happens, just imagine a graphic that shows, really our usual media mentions are like 300 maybe a month, maybe something like that in terms of print and broadcast media and digital media. The highest we ever got in 1 week was about 1,100 after Robin Williams killed himself. After Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade killed themselves, we had over 10,000 media mentions on 2 separate days. And they were like within 3 days of each other. And those led to record numbers of calls. Why are we losing? This is weird. All right, so we can just make that a projective test. I can just tell you what is there. Is basically a graphic that shows that the highest calls that we've ever gotten have been due to media influence. The media reporting on Robin Williams and including our number, and the media reporting on Kate Spade and our number, the media reporting on Anthony Bourdain and our number, and when Logic also had his national appearances and released his song, we also saw calls go through the roof. So media has a huge influence by including our number, and you can as well. A few notes about data, and I want to make sure that, oh my gosh, we are missing this. That's really weird. I don't know why. Yeah. So again, we'll just walk you through this. It's important when you're wanting to include data in some way that you talk with suicide experts, suicide prevention experts, because it's very easy to misread numbers. And I'm going to give you an example of what is not here and what should be here. But the suicide story is basically the story of tragedy, which is where we say, and this is the one we typically tell, we've got about 45,000 people who die every year by suicide right now. And we saw some of the statistics here in Oregon. And then there's also data on the number of hospitalizations for people who've tried to kill themselves. We also have about 2.5 million people who tried to kill themselves and about 12.6 million people who think seriously about suicide every year. When you look at it that way, it's horrific. It's sad. It's a story of misery. But what you don't see here, and I'll tell you, is you can just kind of flip that and ask yourself the question, what's the difference between the people that thought seriously about suicide? Because they far outnumber the number of people that kill themselves. Again, 45,000 people a year who kill themselves, 12.6 million people who think seriously about it. When you do the math on that, it's about for every one person who dies by suicide, there's about 280 other people who think seriously about it but don't. And those are all untold stories of suicide prevention. And those are stories that we're not hearing. I mean, it's the only way, it's hard to quantify something that's not happening, but that's a number that helps quantify how suicides are being prevented. But we are not telling those stories. And this is something that we mentioned when the CDC was reporting an increase in suicides. We included also, it's all here. And you can see here that we noted it's a horrible thing. And this is how you interpret data from an expert standpoint, and how you balance the report. It's horrible to see the CDC statistics that show suicides are increasing. That's undeniable and important to report. It's also important to report that, and most suicides are prevented. We just need to prevent more. The Papageno effect, again, the embeds are just not showing up here, but excuse me, This was the data that was really important that came out in 2010 that showed when the media tells stories of people coping through suicidal moments, it actually can reduce the suicide rate. And if that's the case, boy, we can just forget these. What these are all really examples of are headlines that appeared, because I spoke with a lot of reporters about, look, you want to know what to write about? Write about stories of hope and recovery. Here's why, and talk to them about the Papageno effect. And many of them said, yeah, well, that's what we'll do. We want to say something more about Spade and Bourdain, but there's nothing more to say. What really there is to say is how do we live with this, and how are people living with this, and how are people living through this? And those are the stories that we wanted to get out there. And we saw quite a number of stories, which they're up there somewhere. And again, they had stories of hope and healing on the Today Show, CNN, and CBS. So this is a summary essentially of what to do and how to tell the story of suicide prevention and not just suicide. And that is make sure that we include resources for help, actions that people can take to prevent suicide, data indicating the prevalence of prevention, that it's working, and effective treatments that show that if you get care, it can make a difference. So those are the things that we know can reduce suicides. And Dwight was talking earlier about it feels like a wedding here. I mean, we really want to engage media in a partnership, and I guess a marriage, and not only reporting on suicide responsibly, but also helping us change the conversation from suicide to suicide prevention. Thank you.
Stay here, because we thought we'd just open it up for some Q&A with John from the journalists. Pat, Doris.
So I have a question. Not far from here, there's a bridge called Vista Bridge, which just has this and not to report about it because they also call it suicide bridge.
Right.
So a number of people jumping off, became this big community thing, should we build a fence or not? And every time we go to tell the story, it's hard to avoid the fact that somebody else has committed suicide there. Any suggestions for reporting that?
It's a great question. There was a movie. Did anyone see the movie The Bridge that came out? Yeah, it was a powerful movie. It was a documentary about the Golden Gate Bridge, the suicide capital of the world. Arguably, that piece of journalism was the reason that the Golden Gate Bridge now is going to get barriers. It told the story, the tragic story, that now nobody could turn away from, because when people jumped off the bridge, they seemed to just disappear into the water, and those stories disappeared with them. But when you had it on film, it was really quite grisly, and it's not for everyone to watch, and I wouldn't really recommend that anything like that ever be repeated. But the fact is that for over 50 years, people were saying over and over, you need to put up barriers, and people kept saying, no, it's going to ruin the beauty of the bridge, etc. But they couldn't turn away after this. What the movie did right, aside from just showing the suicides, which was actually dangerous, and we do know that there's some people who jumped off the bridge after seeing the movie. But what it did right was tell the stories of the ripple effects. When a person hits the water, their story doesn't disappear. That leaves a legacy in the lives of the people who care about them, and it told their stories. And that suffering, and those are the same people who stood before legislators and the Golden Gate Bridge Authority and said, you cannot let my son's life go forgotten. And this movie wouldn't let them forget it. What it really could have and should have done, would have been better, is tell the story of barriers. And that's what I would suggest, is that, if you can say, yes, people have jumped off here, but let me tell you some stories about all over the world where they've put up barriers on bridges. It has eliminated suicides in those areas. And that's an important story to tell. I wrote a white paper on this a few years ago because people were phoning up the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, me, and saying specifically, hey, they want to put up these barriers in this area, and we think it's going to ruin the beauty of the bridge. And so can we just put up a hotline instead? And I got a lot of those calls. And my answer to that was no. And so that's why I wrote the paper, is we need to tell the story of the barriers. So that's what I would suggest.
I'm not aware of any suicide there since the very low. David, do you play?
Yeah, and that's a story worth telling. I mean, you know, it's kind of saying, you know, well, we've already done our job by telling people that people were jumping off there, but in fact, you know, you might have encouraged some. So really the story to tell now is, after 5 years, how's it been? That's a really important point, and a myth about suicide is that, well, if we just stop them from jumping off the bridge, they'll just go use a gun, or they'll hang themselves. It's a very interesting way of it helps highlight what's going on in the suicidal mind. Is there is ambivalence at the very core. No one wants to die. They just want the pain to go away. So, you know, if what they will typically do is, then if they're thinking about making the pain go away, and I have a gun and I'm comfortable with a gun, I shoot a gun all the time. So that's what I would do. So in something that makes them naturally very uncomfortable and agitated, this is a familiar method for me. If you take away that familiar method, then in some ways it again highlights the ambivalence. Like, okay, since I can't, that won't be my way out, maybe I should think about something else. And rarely do they think about other ways to kill themselves. So we've seen this world over. So in China, when many farmers were dying by poisonings, what they did was just put the poisons in lock boxes, just made it one step harder for people to kill themselves, and the suicide rates went way down. And again, same thing with barriers. So whenever you just make it harder for people to kill themselves, where they have to think a little bit more or wait a little bit more, that makes a difference.
Traditional media, such as most of the people who are in this room. Have there been any best practices in engaging the media that the kids are using, like Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, to send prevention messages?
We have a partnership with Facebook, and work very closely with them. And I would say Facebook is a leader in suicide prevention work. Here's what we've been doing with them. The bottom line is that the best way to prevent suicide is helping people feel connected to each other. It just so happens that Facebook's mission initially was to connect the whole world. So potentially, and now it's to connect people meaningfully, which is even better. That's a suicide prevention message, period. So we went to them in 2014. We'd been working with them for ages. Their initial thought was like, we just want, and this is what most social media has done, let's just, you know, if somebody says they're going to kill themselves on our platform, let's just make it easy for their friends to report them to us, and then, you know, we'll call the cops or something like that. And then they said, no, let's use the lifeline. And so eventually that's when they engaged us. We worked with them for years, and so that was the main thing. And then eventually we said to them, well, we should do something more, because you have a connected environment. If I'm going to go on Facebook and say, I want to kill myself, I'm not looking for somebody to report me. I'm looking for somebody to support me. So if we can educate their friends about how to help each other, give them tools to help each other, so when they report, they get back, I know you're concerned about Joe. Thank you for reporting. Would you like to tell your other friends about Joe and what's going on with him? Here's some helpful resources that you could tell Joe about that could be useful. Here's some videos he could look at. Here's some things that we can help you with, some sentences or phrases that you can use to talk with Joe about how you're concerned about them. So these are things that we worked with them on doing, and they established those, they piloted them in 2015, and they went global in 2016. So whenever you try to report on Facebook that somebody could be suicidal, you'll get back this response, and you'll be giving these tools. They also send those tools and resources to the persons who they've reported who are at risk so they can help themselves as well. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think people have made a big deal out of it. I wish they would. I mean, it's just not, there's been, you know, what I wish they would do, and, you know, and I'm not even sure about this, is wish Facebook would talk about the degree to which people are using that tool and they feel like it's useful, or people have reported that it's useful. That is an area of reporting that could certainly be investigated.
In terms of suicide by cop, it's generated a lot of discussion recently. I wanted to hear what you have to say about that, and if reporting on suicide by cop incidents has been appropriate, and if you have any suggestions.
John, can you repeat the question?
So the question is suicide by cop, and you know, do I have any suggestions on how to report that, or how to report on that, or you know, it's a really it's a real phenomenon. The degree to which it's prevalent, I don't think anyone knows. You know, there's a number of people that you know, that do what we used to call parasuicidal things, where they're just so self-destructive that, you know, what looks like a car accident or looks like an overdose is just people who really just didn't care about living anymore. It's more kind of a reckless indifference to living. So it's complicated. You know, unless a person says, you know, I want you to kill me, you know, but I'm really, it's an interesting question. I don't really know how to respond to that. It's not, I'll tell you, it's interesting that kind of in that same neighborhood is that about 75% of adolescent school shooters are suicidal first. So I think from our standpoint, the more we can do suicide prevention work, the more we can protect people from getting in front of cops and saying, shoot me, or going to schools and shooting up schools.
A lot of our sessions around suicide in kind of the breaking news environment deal with people who, oh, thank you. I'll repeat, a lot of our kind of conversations around suicide in a breaking news type situation involve, you know, police have shut down a bridge because someone is, you know, on the ledge, or some other kind of public, you know, a high profile, not necessarily a high profile person, but in a high profile kind of manner. Do you have any recommendations on how we should cover that, especially when kind of we're also balancing informing the public of disruptions or avoid the area, things like that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. I would avoid reporting on it, and you could say, you know, due to, you know, some disruption on the bridge, because it really, that's a perfect example of begging for more. If people say, you know, everybody stopped what they were doing and watched me, just invites more of the same. And that's not good for anybody. So what you do is just, you know, report it as a traffic problem. Now, if it's a high-profile person that people recognize, you know, that just happens to be, you know, the mayor or somebody that, you know, then of course you have a different story. And then, you know, all the other reporting issues apply, is that, you know, if they talk him down and got him through it, that's an important story to tell. Not just, you know, how suicidal he was, but, you know, and if he does kill himself, you know, everything else that we've talked about applies. You know, how you write about that in terms of not glorifying it or romanticizing it, and really making sure that, you know, people have resources for help. And then you can switch the story the next day to do something on suicide prevention.
Hi, and mine's a good segue because I feel like when I was a full-time journalist, we did not report on suicide, and maybe that's where this taboo today comes from, because we're not sure what to do. I now advise the student newspaper at Clackamas Community College, and we had an incoming recruit kill himself on the wrestling team a couple weeks ago. I'm not sure how to advise my students, because in this conversation, now I'm thinking, can any good come of us reporting this at all? So can you speak a little bit to judgment call? I mean, I know our wrestling team is coping with this. There's a counselor here from my college. But as the advisor, and my students are very conscientious about reporting about anxiety.
Right.
I think they are very aware that we are in a vulnerable population. But can you speak to where is the judgment on whether reporting on it at all can be helpful?
Yeah, that's, again, very important question. The AP recommends to their writers, don't ever report on a suicide unless it's, you know, a very public figure. You know, what you could do is, you know, years later or a year later, go back and interview people and say, how did you deal with this? Or watch the story about how people recover, and at some point, you know, tell that story and how people came together. But again, focusing more on the suicide prevention story, it's not, I don't think the family needs the story. I don't think the community needs the story. It's a terrible thing that happened, and I think we're drawn to, I mean, news stories are kind of naturally drawn to things that just scare the hell out of us. And people are drawn to reading that. But it's just a decision you got to make as to whether you think it's helpful or not. And the AP has said that we don't think it's helpful.
But using it as an opportunity to talk about suicide prevention resources and about stories of health and hopelessness, which we can help you find, it's a great segue.
So this is a follow-up, and it may be better for Dwight, but I think, well, most people may learn of suicides from the CNNs of the world. Most news outlets that report suicides are not the CNNs of the world. They're the Malheur Enterprise, the Estacada News, the Madras Pioneer, publications that you've never heard of, but are in small communities where a suicide is news and it's talked about, and there are editors struggling. So I don't want you to answer all the questions now, but I'm wondering, have you thought of creating like a hotline for journalists where honestly there are lots of publications in small market TV markets where you may have 3 people in the newsroom, there's a suicide, they don't know what to do. What I'm hearing here is great advice, but it's not to them, and they're not in this room because they can't take 3 hours out of their day.
What a great suggestion. I love that. I mean, if there was a way in which, you know, we could have kind of a national technical assistance center for, you know, that would be standing behind the media guidelines, that's such a great idea, and something worth talking with the federal government about.
So, conflicted here in a way, when we asked a question about the bridge, you know, we report what's going on. So if the entire interstate bridge is shut down and you've got 2 hours of gridlock, you know, we struggle with, we can't go on the air and say there's a problem on the, every viewer, every listener, every reader is going to say, what is the problem? That's the question.
If there's a car accident, what would you do, Rick?
We would report a car accident.
Yeah.
Right. So does anyone agree with me here from the journalism side? It's like,
But do you all televise the car accident?
sure, if it's shut down the interstate bridge
But-
and there's 2 hours of gridlock, we'll fly the helicopter, we'll tell the what and is happening. So there's a conflict there. And I have another question about the method of how, when Robin Williams died,
Right.
everyone, a lot of readers, listeners, viewers want to know how. That's just the
Right.
general, how'd he commit,
Right.
how'd he kill himself?
Right.
So that's a conflict with our jobs as journalists to report the details, the who, what, when, where, why, how.
Right. And these are all great questions and natural questions. So let's go back to the bridge situation. you know, with a car accident, people aren't looking to have a car accident on the bridge. I mean, it's just that, it's an accident. So, I mean, I guess you could report that, and that makes sense. But, you know, but what's really pertinent to people, I think in the community, is that you want to avoid going to this bridge right now because it's a traffic jam. So you could report there's a traffic jam, there's an incident. You know, what they do on the subways in New York is they say there's police action. You know, they never tell us what the police action is. They say the police action is causing, you know, and it's like, well, we can just assume whatever. And then we go about our business. But if you don't want this to happen again, if you don't want it to be a magnet for more of the same, then don't report it. I mean, it's a decision you'll make, but I'm just telling you, I'm not sure it's helpful. I understand that from a news perspective, you want to give as much information as possible, but just decide, is that information, what's useful to your public, and what do they need to know?
John, what about something like saying police are working with someone in distress?
Or a mental health crisis is what we.
Or a mental health crisis? Because then you're not, obviously you're getting down the road that you don't want these guys to go down, but they're trying to figure out how to answer a question that all their readers are wondering.
To be honest with you, I'm still not comfortable with that. You know, I understand. I mean, so this is where you go to get help from a mental health crisis. I mean, you just, again, understanding the power of media here is that an important story? Why is that an important story to tell? That's my question, but I think I understand that the very natural thing about it is like, we should tell them everything. But you make choices every time editorial-wise about, you know, what to include and what not to include in the story. So I just want you to know what the implications are when you're making those decisions.
John, on the second question on means, let me ask Rick and other journalists, would it,
Right.
I guess
Yeah,
ask
we'll
you
talk
too
about
as
that,
well, would it work to say we're not going to be reporting on the means because we know there's research that suggests that can have problematic impacts in the community? Or John, does that work for you first?
You know, you can include that in there. That's a separate article, I think. I mean, and, you know, again, there's plenty of articles that don't report the means, and so they've made the decision not to do that. It's not something you have to do. And again, I guess the question is why, if you know it's going to have a negative effect. It doesn't help the family. It doesn't help people who are reading. I don't need to know how he died. I mean, I personally don't. People ask the question. Here's the thing, is that the question of why is just a question that is so seductive for everyone after somebody kills themselves. How many people saw A Million Little Things last night? Anybody see that? It's on late, yeah. It was about some friends who lost someone to suicide, so it's a pretty pertinent story to what we're talking about. But when people lose someone to suicide, the two questions that just nag at them for the rest of their lives is why? And was there something more I could have done? And those questions never go away for the people who've lost somebody. And they get quieter over time, and they get, you know, less frequently asked in their head, but they never go away because you're never going to come up with a satisfactory answer for that. Because you could say, well, you know, he was always so depressed. And I know so many people who are so depressed. I mean, inevitably, a family member is going to say, yeah, but Joe is much worse off than our Bob, and he didn't kill himself. There's just no easy answer. So here, that why or how did he kill himself? You know, somebody's going to report on that. You just want to decide whether or not you need to do that.
John, I have a quick question for you. Just a few weeks ago, driving to work in the morning, it was 4:30, I could see there were police cars on the Hawthorne Bridge. I got through, I couldn't tell what was going on, but by the time I got to work, we were reporting that there was somebody with a mental health crisis that police were trying to save. So that was the few sentences that went on the air. We started getting phone calls from listeners watching all this back and forth. And then we did the happy ending because police were able to help that person and connect them with the right resources.
Well, that's
So
nice.
is that okay? I mean, in your mind, in terms of reporting, it was honest, we didn't lie about what it was, and yet police seemed to do the right thing, and at our end, it seemed like we were doing the right thing.
Again, if you're going to go that route, that's as good a thing as you can do, if you're going to make that decision. And, you know, here's what's always nice is to show how people are helping others and how people got help. So if that becomes the theme of the story, that's great. But really, you know, what you want to emphasize is it's not, you know, they didn't have to go to the bridge and threaten to jump to get help, hopefully. We don't want to say that want to give the indication that that's the way they get it. But if that's what happened, you know, I think you can tell that story. What bothers me, frankly, just personally, is that those are the stories we want to tell. Why don't we tell the stories about, you know, how people have, you know, got help and got through it? We weren't on the bridge. We weren't disrupting traffic. You know, what effective treatments are happening out there? Or what's the story of? I'll tell you a story that I thought was really interesting. That again was about a bridge. And I'll tell you what was good about it. And this guy's getting a whole lot of attention for this in the media. I don't know if y'all have heard about this guy who, in Minneapolis, he was driving along bridge and he saw this guy who was going to jump off the bridge. And he pulled over in his truck, and he had seen Denzel Washington in Inside Man. He was a hostage negotiator. It's a Spike Lee film. And he said it was channeling my inner Denzel. And so he went up there. I talked with this guy. His name's Kwame. And Kwame went up to him and he said, you know, I knew I have to, like Denzel, build rapport. And so, you know, he started, you know, I said, so, man, what are you up here for? You know, and started talking with him. I said, I'm going to kill myself. And he said, you know, what do you need? What can I get for you? The police started to show up, and that just spooked him. And he said, I'm going to jump. And the police stepped back, and Kwame was just standing there with him. And Kwame said to him, you know, I can just get you something. Can I get you a burger? I said, no. He said, you know, I can give you some money. I don't want your money. I don't want your money. And he said, I've got a 6-pack of beer. Okay. So we call that the beer, the 1-2 approach. But what's so interesting about that, and what makes it interesting, is it's about people, not just cops, but people coming over to somebody and saying, how can I help? I mean, again, it's a dramatic story, but the real thing is that Kwame is just a regular guy. He doesn't have to be a cop. And Kwame said, what can I do? And taking an act, that's an extraordinary thing. And when you get something like that's a story that, like, what's extraordinary is it wasn't a cop, and it was a guy who actually was influenced by the media positively to do something. He saw Denzel do these great things. I want to do like, and now he's influencing people. So that's, and his story was like told on Ellen and a few other places. And anyway, so you know, use your judgment. But I do like, if you're going to tell the story, really focusing on help and what people did to get through it. And if there's a way to talk with the guy in any way later about, you know, what was helpful for him, that's great too.
John, Hank Stern from Senator Wyden's office had a question, and then we'll move into the next panel, but John's on the next panel too, so if you still have questions, he ain't going anywhere.
Hank, wait.
In the aftermath of the Washington State quarterback who killed himself, very prominent football player, the family's been very vocal and has gotten a lot of coverage for the foundation they've started and the stories I've seen on ESPN, Sports Illustrated, the requisite, here's how you get help, all of that stuff. Right. But in your judgment, does that coverage run the risk of calling more attention to this guy and creating more potential copycats?
You know, I use use that when you're talking about that as a bridge to talking about what their message is. What's the message of that family? The message is, you know, there's help available. So let's talk about that help that's available. You know, you can use that as your kind of opening is, you know, after the Washington quarterback killed himself, you know, the family was determined to do something and whatever they could do to prevent this from happening again. And here's what they learned, and here's what, you know, so use it as a bridge to talk about suicide prevention rather than focusing on the incident itself.